Hey everyone, and welcome to Human Anatomy here at Moore Park College. I'm Dr. Erica Malhart, and I'm going to be your professor for this semester. I look forward to meeting all of you guys virtually in the online office hours. So today we're going to be covering chapter 1 in your textbook. So all my lectures really follow the textbook very closely. So feel free to read the chapters ahead of time or refer to the chapters if you have any questions or want to dive a little bit deeper into the topics. So today is really just about an orientation of the human body. So how do we talk about the human body? What are some different disciplines within anatomy? So really this is what we're going to be talking about today, and it'll kind of lay an outline for the rest of the course. So we are going to be studying anatomy, but we always talk about anatomy and physiology together, right? So you're going to be taking anatomy in this course, and then you will be taking physiology in your next course. So what is the actual difference between anatomy and physiology? How are they similar? How are they different? Well, when we're studying just anatomy, we're studying the structures of the human body or any other animal or body, right? So we're just kind of covering the structures, which is very memorization based, versus physiology, which is really the function of those structures within the human body. So we really can't talk about one without talking about the other one. So we will be covering a little bit of physiology because it's good to know a little bit about the function of these structures. If you just are memorizing names and locations, that's fairly boring. So we're going to do a little bit of physiology as well. And then in your physiology course, you'll really dive a lot deeper into the functions of these structures. So what are some subdisciplines of anatomy? It's a very broad category, right? So yes, there's many structures in the body, but how can we kind of break that up into different subdisciplines? So gross anatomy is really what we're going to be mostly covering in this course. So there's two different types of kind of gross anatomy, or ways you can study gross anatomy. There's regional anatomy and systemic anatomy. So regional sounds just like it is named. You're going to pick out a region in the body, say the head, right? And you're going to study all the structures in the head, so all in one region. So that's one way to study gross anatomy. But the way we're going to be studying it is systemic anatomy. So that's why I have it starred. So you're going to talk about all the organs that have a related function, right? So you're going to talk about the cardiovascular system, the heart and the vessels all together, instead of just covering all the organs in the chest, say. So then you talk about the lungs as well, right? So systemic anatomy is the way we're going to be studying anatomy in this course. Okay, and we'll go through the organ systems here in a little bit. So surface anatomy is really important for kind of the medical field and maybe physical therapy. So it's where you can see the deeper structures on the surface. So where you can see the vein, right, to draw blood, where you can see that muscle or that joint. So it's all about the surface structures of the body. And we don't cover too much in this course. But we do a lot of microscopic anatomy, which is also called histology. So our second lecture in this unit is all going to really be about histology, which is on the microscopic level, right? So we're looking at tissues of the body under the microscope. Okay, so we're looking at all the cells. And other branches of anatomy that we don't cover too much in this course, because you can take whole classes on these other branches of anatomy. So developmental anatomy or biology is really showing the changes through life. How do organs and tissues change over time? Embryology, right? The development of a human or an animal or these tissues and organs. So it's all before birth is embryology, what's happening in utero. And then pathology. So we will cover a little embryology, a little pathology, because first you kind of learn how all the organs are supposed to work correctly. And then what happens if a disease process, how does that change that organ or that organ system? So we'll cover a little bit of pathology and common diseases in these different organ systems. And then last but not least, radiography. So there's a lot of different imaging disciplines within the medical field. So you're really looking at internal structures through imaging, right? Instead of cutting something open in surgery, you have these great tools available to you to be able to get, imaging of these internal structures. So anatomic terminology, what does that mean? Well, it means that as we go through this course, you're really going to be learning a new language because all of these structures and their names are really based in ancient Greek or Latin. So you're going to come across quite a few strange words, but you may see them over and over again. So that's what these root words are called. They're in a lot of other words. So you may see them over and over again. So if you kind of get used to what a root word means, you can kind of work out the rest of the word or the rest of the structure. So just some examples of these root words would be para. So para is a root word, such as in parasternal. So para just itself means next to, beside, or near. So parasternal means next to the sternum, right? So the sternum is in your chest, like your chest bone. So if it was parasternal, it'd be just next to the sternum, okay? Or ante. So ante, like antebrachium. And this is going to be preceding or before, if you've ever heard of an anteroom, right? So that's kind of the entrance way to a house. So it's before or preceding the rest of the house. So antebrachium, brachium is your arm, your upper arm. And so antebrachium would be your forearm. So it's before the arm, okay? Trans just means across or through, okay? So such as transmembrane, it's going to be across a membrane, like a cell membrane, okay? So I'll give you guys some root words as we go through the course, and you'll see it a lot in lab as well. So just get used to kind of recognizing these root words, and they're going to help you once we learn those regional terms. What does sternum, brachium, right? All those terms as well. So really, you guys will be learning a new language, which is a challenge, right? Lots of memorization, but you guys will get through it. So when we're talking about anatomy, we're really talking about the metric system as well. So I know here in the US, we don't use the metric system very much, so we're unfamiliar with it, right? So this is when we're talking about liters and grams, right? So the metric system, so millimeters, centimeters, but a lot of times we're talking about volume in anatomy. So just get a little familiar with the metric system so you're not caught off guard if you see something measured in the metric system. So now we're going to get into the hierarchy of structural organization. So this is really how is the body organized, kind of on a microscopic level into a more gross level, right? So first we're going to start off in the chemical level. So if you think back to chemistry, biology, you think of atoms, right? And atoms form molecules. So you bring a bunch of atoms together and you get molecules. And then you get these structures that are bigger, so macromolecules, such as a protein, right? Or a lipid, fat, right? And then you get to the cellular level. So then these molecules that are all similar molecules come together to make up a cell, right? So such as these phospholipids, which are fats, they come together to make up the plasma membrane of the cell, right? So then you have that cellular level, excuse me. And then you get the tissue level. So then you bring in cells that have similar function, okay? So all these groups of cells that are doing the same thing are going to make up a tissue. Okay, so here is our epithelial tissue. Okay, so we'll talk all about epithelial tissue in our next lecture. So this will come together to make the wall of a blood vessel. Okay, so then if you bring all these tissues together, you're going to make an organ. Okay, so an organ is going to have multiple tissue types. Okay, so yeah, we talked about that epithelial tissue, but when you're talking about an actual organ, you're also going to have some smooth muscle tissue, some connective tissue, and so then you're now on the organ level. Okay. So then when we talk about organs altogether is an organ system. So organs that are performing the same function or the same purpose is going to be an organ system, such as the cardiovascular system. So not only do we have those blood vessels that we just talked about, but we also have the heart, right? So that's an organ. The blood vessels are organs, right? So they come together to be an organ system. And then the organismal level is the highest level. So again, all those organ systems come together to create, a life being, whether that be a human or an animal or whatever that may be, right? So that is how the body is organized. All living beings are organized this way, right? So we go from small to big. So we just talked about the hierarchy of structural organization. So once we get organs kind of forming out of the tissues, we're going to put these organs together into organ systems. So we said that we're going to study anatomy via this systemic anatomy. So these are these organ systems that we're going to go through each and every one individually. And so this is really kind of an outline for the rest of the course. And this is the order that we're going to be talking about all these organ systems. So the first system we're going to talk about is the integumentary system. So the integumentary system is really forming an external body covering. So what is that? Well, that's our skin, right? So it's a protective layer to protect all the deeper tissues, okay? So the skin covers our whole body. But not only is the skin part of the integumentary system, but so is our hair and nails, okay? So we can't forget about the hair and nails. So some functions of the integumentary system besides protecting those deeper tissues, well, our skin synthesizes vitamin D, right? So it uses that UV light and converts it into an active form of vitamin D that our body can utilize. The skin also contains sweat and oil glands, which are important for, well, sweat is important for thermoregulation, right? And oil keeps our skin healthy and protective. But then we also use the skin and these cutaneous receptors so that we can feel things. So we can feel pressure, touch, pain, right? So these guys contain these cutaneous receptors. When you see cutaneous, that's always going to be having to do with the skin, okay? So these cutaneous receptors are really part of the nervous system, but they are housed within the skin. Okay, and we'll talk more about these guys later. So the second organ system is the skeletal system. So the bones are very protective and supportive of our organs, right? You think of the skull and the brain being inside that, the rib cage. But besides being supportive, it also provides framework for the muscles. So the muscles are going to attach to the bones, and that way they can move the bones and therefore move our body. But some other important functions of the skeletal system that we may not think about is that we form our blood cells within the bones. So in the bone marrow, which we'll talk all about, is where we produce red blood cells, white blood cells in the body. So very important job. As well as storing important minerals such as calcium. So calcium, you always hear, drink your calcium, take your calcium supplement for strong bones, right? So calcium is stored in the bones, but then we're able to use it in the body for important things. Now we're going to talk about the muscular system. So we said that muscles attach to bones, right? So this allows for movement, for manipulation of the environment, right? So we're able to move our bones and our body. So we can maintain posture, locomotion, we can move. So these are very important things that the muscular system does, right? Kind of the obvious function. But we also don't think about is that it produces heat. So when muscles are contracting and doing work, they're going to be giving off heat, right? So that's very important for thermoregulation. Facial expression, right? So that just kind of goes along with movement, but it's a big part of nonverbal communication. So next is the nervous system. So it's really our control system of the body, but it's amazing. It's very simplistic because we say, it's, responding to internal and external changes, whether that be, something inside of you or something outside. Your nervous system is what is responding and making things happen, but it's very fast acting. Right? Say you think about moving your arm, right? But that signal has to come from your brain all the way through your spinal cord out to your arm, right? Through that spinal nerve. So it's amazing how fast this nervous system actually is. And it's almost unbelievable how fast it is. So it's very simplistic in the way that, it's our control system, but as we learn about the nervous system, it's amazing. So now the endocrine system is probably a system that you may not be familiar with, right? We've talked about bones and muscles and nerves. We're very familiar with those types of organs and systems. But the endocrine system is something that people kind of forget about, but it's very, very important. Even though we say that the nervous system is kind of the control system of the body, well, the endocrine system regulates a lot of body function. And they are these discrete glands that live throughout the body. So it's not a connected system like you would think of. The bones and the muscles are all interconnected, right? And same with the nervous system. The brain's connected to the spinal cord and so on. But these are discrete glands. So such as this thyroid gland, the thymus, right? And even some of the organs like the pancreas. These guys have endocrine functions. So they're kind of scattered throughout the body, right? So they don't have direct connection to anything. But what they do produce is hormones. So these glands produce hormones that go through the bloodstream, and that's how it travels around the body, and it regulates things like growth, reproduction, nutrient use, right? How do we utilize the nutrients that we acquire? So it's also a very big control system, okay? Very similar like the nervous system, but a little bit different. So the endocrine system, I think, is very cool, even though a lot of people forget about it and don't give it enough credit. So now the cardiovascular system. So really, when we think about the cardiovascular system, we're thinking about the heart, right? So the heart pumps blood through the blood vessels. So really, it's the heart the blood, and the blood vessels. So blood vessels are really just responsible for transporting the blood around the body, because the blood is kind of like the life force, right? So it's carrying vital things that we need for life, right? Oxygen, nutrients. But so not only is it providing all the tissues of the body with these vital products, it's also taking the waste away from the tissues. So you can think of our body kind of like a machine, right? So think of it like a car. You know, it's going to be producing waste, right? It's going to be using the oil, like the blood, right, to make the machine work. But you're always going to be producing energy. You're going to be producing wastes. So our waste is in form of carbon dioxide and some metabolic wastes as well that we'll talk about, okay? So very important, not only are you transporting the good things to the tissues, you're taking away the bad things from the tissues as well, okay? So we've talked about the cardiovascular system, and another system that goes hand in hand with the cardiovascular system is the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system and the immune system work together, and they're overall part of the circulatory system. So again, it's not part of the cardiovascular system, but it's part of the circulatory system. So we talked about those blood vessels taking the blood out to the tissues. Well, when we have that gas and nutrient exchange within those blood vessels and in the tissues, some of that fluid leaks out of those blood vessels. And that is where the lymphatic system comes into play. The lymphatic vessels pick up that leaked out fluid. And maybe some debris as well, maybe some cells or any bacteria or viruses, anything that's not supposed to be there, it'll also pick up. So then it brings it back to the heart, back to the cardiovascular system, but it filters it along the way. We don't want to bring any of these foreign objects back into the cardiovascular system. And that's where the lymph nodes come into play. They act as filters. And within the lymph nodes, we're going to have these white blood cells. So the white blood cells are part of the immune system. So specifically, the lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell, are going to be sitting in those lymph nodes waiting for any sort of foreign substance to come by, right? It's going to filter it all out, and then it's going to mount an immune response against that foreign substance, right? So that's why when you get sick, you have swollen lymph nodes, right? You always feel under your jaw for swollen lymph nodes. Well, that's the reason why, is those immune cells, those white blood cells, are sitting in there and they found something that they need to fight. So they swell up and they fight that foreign substance. So now we'll talk about the respiratory system. So it's fairly straightforward. When we think about the respiratory system, we think about the lungs, right? But there are a few other structures in the upper respiratory system, starting with our nose and our nasal cavity, right? So the air has to come in a certain place, and that's in through the nose, right? So then we have all of these structures in the upper airway, such as our trachea and our larynx up here, right? So trachea is going down into the lungs, and then our larynx is how we make sound, right? How we talk. So again, there's a lot of other structures here besides just the lungs as well, okay? So what is the whole point of the respiratory system? Well, we breathe air in, right? Oxygen. That way we can get the oxygen into the blood to the tissues, so that we can oxygenate all of our tissues, right? Our cells can't survive without oxygen. And then we talked about that waste, right? The cells are like little machines, or our whole body is like a machine, and we're constantly producing waste. And one of the wastes is carbon dioxide. So then not only is it bringing oxygen in, it's going to be taking carbon dioxide out, right? So we're going to be breathing out carbon dioxide to get rid of it out of our body, because it's a waste, right? So the gas exchange is really going to be happening in two places, right? So it's really going to be happening in the lungs, right? So in these air sacs in the lungs, we're going to be, getting oxygen from the lungs into the blood vessels, but then we're also going to be getting that carbon dioxide out of the blood vessels back into the lungs so we can breathe it out. And then you're also getting gas exchange in the tissues, right? So you're bringing that oxygen out to the tissues, you're getting rid of that carbon dioxide out of the tissues and bringing it back to the lungs. So the respiratory system also works very closely with the cardiovascular system, okay? So the digestive system. I think the digestive system gets a bad rap, but I love the digestive system. So really, we're eating food, right? Drinking water. We're getting our nutrients from the digestive system, right? So we have to break down that food into things that we can use, right? Into absorbable units that can go into the bloodstream and that our tissues and our cells can use as energy, right? Sugar, that's the big thing, right? And anything that we can't absorb, or we call indigestible foodstuffs, we eliminate as feces, right? So we eat what we want, we utilize what we need, and we eliminate what we can't use, okay? So now the urinary system. So when we think about the urinary system, we think about the bladder, right? Urine. But really, we need to remember the kidneys as well. So the kidneys are really the big player in the urinary system, because what do the kidneys do? They are going to filter blood. So all of our blood is going to go through the kidney at some point. And what the kidneys do is it eliminates all those metabolic wastes. So we talk about the cells always producing waste, right? So we got rid of the carbon dioxide waste in the respiratory system, but how do we get rid of these nitrogenous, or also called metabolic wastes, okay? And that is going to happen in the kidneys. So we're going to regulate things in the body as well. So not only are we eliminating wastes, but the kidneys regulate water, so water volume in the blood, so that's blood pressure, right? Electrolyte balance, acid-base balance. So it's very important in homeostasis, right? Keeping the body at a happy place, happy functioning place. And that's the whole job of the urinary system. Urine is just the waste, okay? And the bladder just stores the urine ready to go. So last but not least, we have the reproductive system. So we have the male and female reproductive systems. They have similar function, but slightly different structures, right? So the overall function of both systems are to produce offspring, right? So the male system contain testes, and testes are really the important sex organ because it produces sperm and the male sex hormones. Okay, so these systems are also part of the endocrine system. So you do get a little crossover here, and other systems as well. You'll see as we go that some organs might be part of multiple systems. Okay, so the female system have the ovaries. So the ovaries are really the organ that is going to be producing the eggs and the female sex hormones. But the female system has an extra job because it has to be able to carry the offspring to term, right? So we also have mammary glands. We also have some other accessory organs to help maintain and support a developing offspring. Okay. So now let's switch gears a little bit now that we've gone through all of the organ systems of the body, and we'll go through each of those individually as the class goes on. But let's talk about how we discuss the anatomy of the body. Okay, and this is called an anatomical terminology. Okay, so we always talk about the body in the same position. So right when you stand up, you probably stand up a certain way. Well, when we talk about anatomical position, the body has to be in a very specific position. So it's almost standing up, but with one difference, is that your palms of your hands are facing forward. So if you stand up, you're standing with your toes pointing forward, your eyes facing forward, and your palms facing forward, and the thumbs pointing out or away from the body. So whenever we talk about the body and any sort of anatomical structure, we're always imagining the body in anatomical position. Okay? So now, when we talk about these different parts of the body and their relationship to other parts of the body, that's using directional terminology or directional terms. So professionals can't just say, oh, the ankle is below the knee, or the elbow's next to the hip, or something like that, right? So it's very, you have to be very specific when you're in the medical profession to describe the location of a body part in relation to another body part. So we'll go through these directional terms and we'll get an idea and a sense for how do you describe one area with reference to another area or another body part. And that brings us to regional terms as well. So yes, we say, we say hand or elbow or shoulder, but if you're talking about the correct anatomical terminology, you have to use different words. That's kind of where the Greek and the Latin come into play. But two big regional terms we'll talk about is the axial region is pretty much just the head, neck, and trunk. So the axial region is really just the main part of the body where all your organs live, okay? Your visceral or internal organs live, okay? So head, neck, trunk. Now when you talk about the appendicular region, think appendages. Okay, what are appendages? Well, those are your limbs, your arms and your legs. Okay, so appendicular region having to do with the limbs. Okay, so those are kind of how we group our regional terms, and then we'll go through and kind of show you guys all the very specific regional terms as well. And you guys are going to do that in your lab as well. So now let's actually go through some of these directional terms. So remember, we're talking about the body in anatomical position, right? So standing, face forward, palms forward, toes forward. So if we have our little man here, let's go through some of these terms. So when we're talking about superior and inferior, so usually these terms come in pairs. Okay, so they're kind of going to be opposite directions from each other. So superior, inferior. So superior is going to be towards the head. Okay, and when we talk about superior and inferior, we're really just talking about the axial region. Okay, so head, neck, and torso. So superior is anything towards the head. Okay, so the head is superior to the abdomen or chest, you could say. Then inferior is going to be away from the head. Okay, so the navel or belly button is inferior to the chin, right? So it's below the chin. So inferior below, superior above, when we're just talking about the axial region. Now, anterior and posterior are the same thing as ventral and dorsal. So ventral and dorsal is used a lot in veterinary medicine, and anterior and posterior is used a lot in human medicine. So a little bit different, but they mean the exact same thing. Okay, so when something is anterior or ventral, it means towards the front of the body. Okay, and when something is more posterior or dorsal, it's to the back of the body. Okay, so some examples are the breastbone is anterior to the spine. Okay, or the heart is posterior to the breastbone. Okay, so again, you're always going to say the first thing is, and then your whatever your directional term is, to another region. Okay, so you're going to compare two regions. Okay. So let's keep going with our directional terms. So we had superior, inferior, anterior, posterior. Now we have medial and lateral. Okay, so now imagine drawing a line right down the middle of your body, right? Right from the top of your head all the way down. So that's called midline. So it's kind of cutting your body in half, right? So medial means anything that's more towards that midline, towards the middle of your body. Okay. Lateral is away from the middle of your body, so away from that midline. Okay. So for example, the heart is medial to the arm, so it's more towards midline. The heart is pretty darn medial, right? It's right almost on midline. Whereas the arms are lateral to the chest. Okay, so they're away from midline. The chest is more medial. Our last two directions are proximal and distal. So the big thing about proximal and distal, it's very similar to superior and inferior, but now we're just talking about the appendicular region, so the appendages. So proximal is closer to the origin of the limb, and that means where does it come off the body? So shoulders for the upper limb, hips for the lower limbs, right? Whereas distal means further away from that origin, so more towards the hands or the toes. Okay? So for example, the elbow is proximal to the wrist, so it's further up, more towards the shoulder. Whereas the knee is distal to the thigh, so it's further down the leg, it's further towards the toes. Okay? And you guys will practice all these terms in the lab exercises, okay? Now these aren't quite as important for the directional terms, but they're good to have in mind. So superficial, I think superficial and deep are a little self-explanatory. So superficial means more on the body surface, whereas deep or internal means more inside the body. Okay? So such as the skin is superficial to the muscles, or the lungs are deep to the skin, right? So superficial and deep. And we probably won't use ipsilateral and contralateral too much in this class, but ipsilateral just means on the same side. So again, we're mostly talking about the appendicular region. So such as the right hand and right foot are ipsilateral, or on the same side. But the right hand and the left foot are contralateral, so they're on the opposite side. Okay. So here's our regional term picture. So all of the regional terms for the axial region, so head, neck, and trunk, are all going to be kind of on the outside, okay, on both pictures. So here's our axial region structures over here. On the front and the back, and then all the appendicular region structures are going to be in the middle. Okay, so these are all the limb structures. Okay, so get a feel for all these guys. You don't need to memorize everything, but we will practice this in lab as well. So just get a good feel for some of these regional terms. So now we're gonna change gears a little bit as well. So we've been talking about how do we compare one structure to another? How do we know, how do we tell somebody else where a body part is, right? So now we're going to talk about how we split the body up into different planes or sections. Now this is really important for medical imaging. Okay, so when we're going to talk through a little bit about some of the modalities for imaging. So this is how do we cut the body up and say, how do we know where organs are in the different sections of the body? So we can cut the body into a frontal or coronal plane. And so this is going to be a vertical division. Okay, so if we look at our little picture over here, here's our coronal plane right here. So essentially think of a crown on somebody's head and then cut it. You're cutting the body in half, but you're cutting it in an anterior and posterior division. Okay. So your nose and everything on the anterior side is going to be in one half, and then the back of your head and your back is going to be in the posterior part. Okay, so that's one way to cut the body. Okay, it's going to be a coronal plane. Now the next one is transverse plane. So transverse is going to be horizontal. So instead of up and down vertical, you're making a horizontal or transverse section. This is also termed a cross section. So maybe some of you guys have heard cross section before, but essentially you're going to divide the body up into a superior portion and an inferior portion. And these can be made anywhere along the body, right? So you could cut it right at the neck and just have the head superior and the rest of the body inferior. So that's a transverse plane. And how I think about transverse as being horizontal, I think about crossing a T. So T crosses over for transverse. Okay. And then the last plane is a sagittal plane. So it's another vertical division up and down, but instead of having an anterior and posterior division, you're going to have a right and a left division. Okay. And we can call it either mid-sagittal if it's right on midline. Remember we talked about drawing a line through the body right through the middle. Or you can have a parasagittal plane. Remember that root word para, next to? So it's right off of midline. So it's offset a little bit from midline. So mid-sagittal or parasagittal planes. They're both considered sagittal planes. So some examples of these planes, remember we said this is really important for imaging. So again, here is that frontal or coronal plane. That was the first one we talked about. So it's cutting the body into anterior and posterior. So here is an image that is made in that frontal plane. Okay. Then we have a transverse plane, or that cross section, so horizontal cutting right through the abdomen there. So here's our image in a transverse plane. And then last but not least, we have our sagittal plane. And this is specifically a mid-sagittal plane because it goes right down midline. And it's going to cut the body into right and left sections. Okay? So another way to split up the body is to talk about body cavities. Okay, so what are body cavities? They are where we house our internal organs. Okay, and then membranes are going to line these body cavities. Okay, like an inner lining. So the dorsal body cavity, remember dorsal is the same as posterior. So it's going to be on that dorsal or posterior side of the body. And this is going to house our brain and spinal cord. So we have the cranial cavity housing the brain and the vertebral cavity housing the spinal cord. Okay, so this is depicted in yellow on our picture. Okay. And then our ventral body cavity is going to be on the anterior side, or ventral, right? Same thing. And it's actually divided into 3 different cavities. Okay. So we have the lateral parts. Okay. So let's look at this picture. Is a little bit easier to see. So we're looking at it straight on or from the anterior view. We have these lateral cavities, and those contain the lungs. Okay? So each lung is surrounded by a membrane, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have the mediastinum. So the mediastinum, think medial, right? Middle, midline, is going to be the heart. Okay, that's the most important structure here. And that's going to also be surrounded by a membrane or a sac. We'll talk about that. And then last but not least, we have the abdominopelvic cavity, okay, which is two sections, the abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. So here in this picture, abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. So this is actually divided into two parts. So the thoracic, we have 3 parts, and then the abdominal pelvic, we have 2 parts. So the ventral body cavity is actually divided up into 5 different sections. Okay. So in the abdominal cavity, right, so we have our abdominal organs, so stomach, liver, spleen, kidneys, digestive stuff, right? Pelvic cavity, we have the bladder and reproductive organs. Okay. So these guys are our body cavities, and lining those cavities are these membranes. So let's talk about that next. So here's just a picture of those body cavities all labeled for you guys. Okay. So, and they're color coded. So ventral body cavity in red, dorsal body cavity in yellow. Okay. So within these body cavities, we have serous cavities. Okay, so, or think of them like serous membranes. Okay. So this is an enclosed cavity with no opening to the outside. Okay. So what this does, think of it like a protective lining around the organ. Okay. So it's going to protect the organ from the trunk, from the ribs, from any sort of bony structure, right? Because our organs are going to be moving in there. Think of the pumping heart, think of the inflating lungs, right? So they're going to be moving in there, and so this is going to decrease the friction in the movement and provide protection for the organ when it does move. So there are 3 serous cavities, okay? So the pleural cavities are going to surround the lungs. So each lung has its own pleural cavity. And the membrane itself is called the pleura. Okay. And then the heart is going to have a pericardial cavity. So the pericardium is the membrane, so that's going to surround the heart. Okay. And then last but not least, we have the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneum is the membrane that lines all the abdominal pelvic organs. Okay. So think of the 3 P's. That's how I remember it, right? So pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal. So these are our serous cavities, which are made up of serous membranes. So what is a serous membrane? Okay. Well, a serous cavity has 2 membranes. So think of the serous cavity as a water balloon. Okay. And the serous membrane is the rubber of that balloon. Okay. And the cavity is the fluid inside that water balloon. Okay. So there's going to be a space in there full of fluid. Okay. So now, if we think of, so our water balloon is our serous cavity, right? And then the rubber lining is the serous membrane. So when we stick an organ inside that cavity, so say our fist is the heart, right? So imagine the fist is the heart, and it's going to be surrounded by that pericardial cavity or pericardium. So now it's going to indent that water balloon. Okay, so now we have two membranes, one that's right up against the heart or the hand, right? And then one that is outside, not right up against the heart, but maybe up against the body wall. Okay, so those are the two different membranes. The outer membrane is the parietal membrane. Okay, and then the one that's right up against the organ is the visceral membrane. Okay, and then there's a space in between full of fluid. So we call that fluid serous fluid, because that serous fluid is produced by the serous membrane and the cells that make up that membrane. We'll talk a bit more about these serous membranes as the course continues. Okay. So here's a great picture of our three serous cavities with those serous membranes. So again, each lung is lined by a pleural cavity. Okay. And again, we have a parietal pleura and a visceral pleura. Okay. So two membranes, right, with fluid in between. Okay. Here's our pericardial cavity, so around the heart, which is very similar to our example with the water balloon and the fist. Okay. So again, we have a parietal pericardium and visceral pericardium. So those two membranes. Okay. And then the peritoneal cavity, I think, is the hardest one to envision. Okay, so essentially imagine all the different organs kind of being stuck into the peritoneal cavity. So again, we're going to have a parietal membrane along the body wall on the outside, and then there's going to be a visceral membrane lining each of these organs. Okay, and there's going to be these little crossover areas that we'll talk about when we talk about the abdominal cavity. Okay, and again, it's filled with serous fluid. Okay. So those are our three P's, our three serous cavities. And I want you guys to definitely know these. So now another way to split up, especially the abdomen, is into quadrants. So we know a lot of organs live in the abdomen, right? And if someone comes in with abdominal pain and they're kind of pointing down to the bottom right, you might think, oh, what lives there? Probably the appendix, right? So it's a way to kind of figure out what organ lives where, okay? And we'll divide it up even further when we get into the digestive system as well. But we can divide it up into 4 quadrants. So we have right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant. And so what might live here that might be pertinent to our medical field? So the right upper quadrant, well, we have the liver, which takes up the majority of the area, as well as the gallbladder. Okay. The stomach kind of lives the majority on the left side, so left upper quadrant, but we also have the spleen over here as well, and the diaphragm kind of sits between both. Okay. So that's very kind of split in between the right and left upper. Then if we look in the lower quadrants, what might live there? Well, we said that right lower quadrant, we've got some intestines there, the cecum, but we also have the appendix. So that's a big one for pain. The left lower quadrant is mostly just colon. So large intestine. And small intestine is kind of all throughout around the umbilical area. And that's why we have it further divided up in the digestive system. Okay, so just be a little familiar with maybe some of these underlined things that, you know, we see come in often in the medical world that causes abdominal pain. So now we're going to switch gears again and talk a little bit about histology. So we're going to talk about microscopic anatomy. So we're going to look at very small things under a microscope. Well, how do we do that? What are some different types of microscopy that we will examine? So light microscopy is probably the most common way to look at tissues. Okay, so it's a lower magnification. You slice the tissue very thin and you shine a light underneath it and you look at it through a microscope. Another way to do it is a higher magnification is electron microscopy. So you actually shoot electrons through the tissue and then you get a higher resolution, higher magnification image. So what do you have to do to the tissue? And again, don't get too caught up on this, but you're going to preserve the tissue and then you're going to have to make a very thin section of the tissue. And then to be able to see certain things, especially with light microscopy, is you're going to have to stain the tissue so that different structures come out with different colors. So usually we do an acid-base stain so that things look a little more pink or a little more purple, and so you can distinguish different structures. But again, preparation is not perfect, so there can be artifacts when you're preparing the tissue. So you could get some damaged tissues, bubbles in the under the lens. So there are different things that can happen and that you have to be aware of when you're looking at slides. So on the left, we have an example of a light micrograph with stain. So we can see that there are some cells up here, right, that look very different than the cells under here, okay? And they stain differently, right? So we have some darker purples and pinks and some lighter pink. We have some really dark purple, right? So this is a light micrograph, okay? Of an epithelial tissue here. Okay. And then if we look at the same tissue but under a transmission electron micrograph, you can tell that there's a lot more detail in it, right? So if we blow up, it's just this section here is the same as this section here. So you get a lot more detail at higher magnification. Okay, so you can really see even all the organelles in the cells. So it's very, very detailed, much more than the light micrograph. So the last way we can look at tissues is scanning electron microscopy. So this is the highest magnification. So you're actually looking at a three-dimensional picture of a whole unsectioned surface. So again, this is those little frillies that were at the top of the last two slides, but you can actually see the three-dimensional detail of that cilia. So that cilia we'll learn about when we talk about epithelial tissue, but it's like these little hairs that sit on the top of the cells. And so you can really get a high magnification image with this scanning electron microscopy. And don't worry about how it's stained, but it's stained a certain way with heavy metals. And essentially it deflects the electrons that they shoot at it. And so you get this different image from the electrons bouncing off that heavy metal. So now we're going to wrap up the end of this lecture with talking a little bit about clinical anatomy. So clinical anatomy, we're really going to talk about some of the different imaging modalities. Okay, so how can we take pictures of our internal structures? So the most common one that you're probably very familiar with, you may have broken an arm when you were a kid and went in for a radiograph. Same thing as an X-ray. So essentially they shoot X-rays and gamma rays through the structure, and then the way it's being absorbed is how you see the different structures. So this is the best for visualizing bones. So very dense structures are best visualized with radiographs. Okay. Now sonography, also called ultrasound, you may be very familiar with as well, and this essentially shoots high wave sound waves, high frequency sound waves through the tissues, and it bounces off in certain ways depending on the soft tissue makeup. So it's going to bounce off fluid different than some other tissues of the body. So this is really good at looking at those soft tissue structures. Not so good at looking at bone. Okay, so very good at looking at abdominal structures, right? This is why, pregnant women go in for their ultrasound to look at the developing embryo and fetus inside the uterus. It's also very safe. Unlike the radiograph where you're being exposed to x-rays and things like that, sonography is much, much safer because you're just using sound waves. Now, magnetic resonance imaging, also called MRI, is very, very good at giving the best quality images of soft tissue. So yeah, we can look at soft tissue with ultrasound, but it's not very clear, it's not very precise. So when we use MRI, it really gives you the highest quality image, but it takes a very long time to produce and it's quite expensive. So we don't use MRIs very much, besides when you really want to see something very, very clear. So if you need to have a surgery on something, usually they'll want an MRI before, so what happens is it creates a very, very good image of soft tissue. And it distinguishes those body tissues relative to the water content of the tissue. And it uses a magnetic field and radio waves to get these very high quality images. So the next medical imaging we use, and we use it more often in emergent situations, is a computed tomography or computed axial tomography, and that's a CT or a CAT scan. Okay, so it is an X-ray, but what you do is you shoot successive X-rays around the body so that you develop a three-dimensional X-ray, essentially. So this also gives you a very detailed picture of the body. It's much faster and much cheaper than an MRI. So that's why we really use it a lot more in the clinical and emergency diagnostic world, because you get very good detail, but it's a lot cheaper and a lot faster to get that answer. It's not as good for joints. So again, if you have, a joint problem, maybe you need surgery on a joint, that's where you're really going to take that MRI to get the best quality image before surgery. Another way that specifically looks at either the heart or the brain is an angiography or angiogram. So essentially you shoot some contrast medium into the vessels and you can see where there is obstruction in that vessel. Okay, so you take an image before and after the contrast to see where that blockage in those vessels are. So that's very important for heart and brain, right? So that's where those tiny vessels that we're really worried about for heart attacks and strokes. So this is an angiography or angiogram. And then the last one we'll talk about is positron emission tomography, or PET or PET scan. And this is really detecting high metabolic activity in the body. So it scans the whole body, or I guess you could do it in a specific area, but usually it scans the whole body and it looks for these high metabolic turnovers. So what happens is you inject a radioactive isotope into the body, and where that high metabolic activity is happening, it's going to uptake that radioactive isotope. And then the imaging is going to pick up on that isotope, and it's going to glow, or it's going to show that area, such as a tumor. So this is a great way to scan the body for tumor development, tumor growth, but it's not detailed at all. Okay, so once you get an area that you might want to look further into, then you're going to do a CT scan or an MRI after the PET scan, once you've found that area of interest. So here's just some images, some examples of all these images, imaging modalities we talked about. So the first is a radiograph, This is a chest radiograph, so the bones show up really nicely, but the lungs are black, right? So anywhere with air is going to be black. And the heart is just kind of a blob. You really can't tell much structures in the heart because it's soft tissue. Whereas the bones, you can see a lot more detail of. A CT scan of the abdomen here, so you get a pretty good detail of those abdominal organs, right? Fast and efficient. A PET scan. So again, this is a human here. You can hardly tell, but where there's a lot of uptake in the heart, but that's fairly common, and in the brain. But then if you look over here, there's these little highlighted dots that they shouldn't be there. So that is tumor growth, okay? So you can tell that could be a breast tumor and probably an axial lymph node in the armpit. So then they would then go on and pick another modality to get a better image of that. Here's an angiogram. So this is the heart here. These are the blood vessels, the coronary arteries surrounding the heart, and they put this black or dark contrast substance in there, and you can see there's an area of narrowing. Okay, so some blockage in that coronary artery. And then here's an ultrasound, and here's the baby or the developing fetus inside the uterus. Okay. So good for soft tissue, but not a lot of detail, right? The MRI is really where you're going to get the most detail, especially in joints. So soft tissue and joints. Okay. So at the end of every lecture, I always give you guys kind of some take-home objectives. So you can go through these and make yourself a little bit of a study guide to make sure you get those take-home objectives and those important topics. And at the end of every lecture, I also give you guys some suggested reading from the textbook, as well as some questions at the end of each chapter in the textbook. And again, these you don't have to turn in. They're not assignments. They're just good review questions. All the multiple choice and matching have the answers in the book. So it's just a good way to test yourself a little bit. We will have quizzes and discussions and things here and there as well, but I think this is good review material as you're studying. So we did chapter 1 today, and next time we're going to cover chapter 4. Okay, so that'll cover 2 lectures. So chapter 4 is quite large, so we will cover it in 2 lectures. I'll record it all in one, but again, it's going to be a long lecture. You guys made it through the first lecture, and I hope to see you guys in office hours this week. Thanks a lot.